Hi everyone. So for my project, I decided to look at the differences in the average age of onset of schizophrenia between males and females. And just a little bit of background about the disorder. Schizophrenia is a neuropsychiatric disorder that affects approximately 1% of the world's population, and symptoms for schizophrenia don't typically onset until early adulthood, so somewhere in the early 20s and 30s. And the American Psychiatric Association states that males actually exhibit symptoms earlier than females do, and this was the main motivation for conducting my analysis. I wanted to see if using this data set, I could get the results that would be consistent with what the APA had published on their website. And so then I wanted to take a look at the literature to see what had been published and what results they had found to see if that was consistent with what the APA had said. And I actually found that there were some contradicting results, and of course some studies did publish that the average age of onset was lower in males and females, but I also did find several studies that found there was no significant difference between males and females. So the data that I decided to use is a data set that can be downloaded directly in R, and this data set contains the sex of the individual as well as their age of onset of schizophrenia. And the title of this data set is just schizophrenia. So I first wanted to look at the summary statistics of the males and the females, just to get a good idea of how the data looked. And I thought it was interesting to note that all the summary statistics for the females are higher than the males, and this is to be expected because this is what the APA had suggested, that males would onset with schizophrenia much earlier than females would. And then I wanted to look at the box plots of the data, which would be separated by gender. And I thought it was interesting to note that between the first and the third quartile for females, all of the data is contained within those brackets. But for males, the first and the third quartile are much more closely placed together. But there are a lot of outliers, and so the spread of the data for each group turns out to be very similar. And then I wanted to look at the distribution of the data just by plotting and looking at the histograms. And I was hoping that the histograms would look as if the data were normally distributed, because then I would be able to do a two-sample t-test. But of course, both of the data sets look as if they are skewed to the right. So then, just to be safe, I did perform a Shapiro-Wilk normality test to see if the data was actually normally distributed. And so this normality test, I was looking to see if it did fit a normal distribution. And the p-value was very small, so we reject the null hypothesis that the data is normally distributed, and therefore we can conclude that this data, the raw data itself, does not follow a normal distribution. And because of this, I decided the next step would be to perform bootstrap resampling. So I did do that, separated males and females into separate groups, and then did bootstrap resampling, and I did this 1,000 times for each group. And as you can see in the histograms, it does look like after the resampling was done that they both fit a normal distribution a lot better than the raw data did before. And so again, to check, I did conduct a Shapiro-Wilk normality test for each of the groups. And so these are the results for the males. I found that this time it was a much larger p-value, and so we failed to reject the null hypothesis, and thus can conclude that the data does fit a normal distribution. So then moving on to the females, there actually was a very similar p-value for the females as there was for males, and we again were able to fail to reject the null hypothesis, and thus conclude that the data does follow a normal distribution. So after I found that both the males and the females bootstrap samples followed a normal distribution, I decided to perform a 2-sample t-test for those samples, and I found that there's a very small p-value, so we would reject the null hypothesis that the difference between the means is 0. So since we're rejecting it, we are saying that there is a significant difference between males and females. And that actually is consistent with what the APA had said in the beginning that I mentioned during the background. And then, just for purely comparison purposes, I decided to do the 2-sample t-test for the raw data that I had mentioned in the beginning that was skewed to the right. And I just wanted to see if the p-values would be similar at all, or if we would come up with the same conclusion. So I actually did find the p-value was a bit larger, but it still did conclude that we would reject the null hypothesis that the difference in the means is equal to 0. So there is a difference between males and females. So then I decided that I would perform a permutation test based on the bootstrap samples, because I wanted to make sure that the test results that I had previously gotten were not due to chance. So I went ahead and did that and did get a p-value that was small enough to reject the null hypothesis that the difference between the means is 0. So again, we did find that the males and the females are significantly different in terms of their average age of onset of schizophrenia, which was consistent with all the other tests that I had done previously. So to summarize, initially the raw data did not fit a normal distribution, so bootstrap resampling seemed like it would be the next step in the analysis, because it would hopefully normalize the data so that I could perform a 2-sample t-test. And after conducting the bootstrap resampling and then using the Shapiro-Wilk normality test, I did find that the males and the females both were successfully normalized through the resampling method, and then I was able to use a 2-sample t-test for the bootstrap samples, and from there we did find that there was a significant difference between males and females in their average age of onset of schizophrenia, which is consistent with what the APA has published on their website. And this is consistent with the rest of the tests that had been conducted, like in comparison with the raw data and the 2-sample t-test. So then additionally, I wanted to perform a permutation test just to ensure that the results that I had gotten previously were not due to chance, and this is done by taking all possible permutations of the data. So after that, I did find that there was a significant difference again between males and females, so that just helped to solidify that that is truly what we found from the data. And so overall, I feel more confident from the permutation test and from using the bootstrap resampling methods to conclude that there actually is a significant difference between the average age of onset in schizophrenia between males and females. And of course I can't say which group has a higher or lower age of onset, but it does appear from the summary statistics, as well as what was published on APA, and from looking at the graphical measures that I had presented earlier, that males do onset earlier than females. But really what we can conclude is that the age of onset between males and females is significantly different. Thanks for watching. So I just wanted to note that the analysis that I conducted was intended to just look at the difference between males and females, their average age of onset, and not if one group necessarily had a lower age of onset than the other. So even though the APA did post specifically that the males had a lower age of onset, I just wanted to see if there was a difference versus there being no difference between them.